It's 1973. You're in a Manhattan apartment. Someone's passing around a small white tablet, stamped with the number 714. It isn't coke. It isn't heroin. It came from a pharmacy, or close enough to one, and a doctor either wrote you a prescription or a stress clinic handed you the maximum legal dose without asking very many questions. You swallow it with wine. Within 30 minutes, the room gets warm and loose. Your muscles unknot. The music feels like it has texture. Every conversation is easier. You feel, as the users of the era described it, like being drunk without the sloppiness, euphoric without the edge. That tablet was a Quaalude, branded as a pharmaceutical, sold as a sleeping pill, marketed explicitly as the safe alternative to the barbiturates that had been killing people for decades. By 1972, Quaaludes were one of the most frequently prescribed sedatives in the United States. By 1981, the DEA had declared them the second most abused drug in the country. By 1984, they were gone. Not banned, but still everywhere gone, the way marijuana was. Actually gone. Vanished from American streets with a completeness that almost no other illegal drug has ever matched before or since. How does a drug disappear? And why did this one, of all of them, actually stay gone? The story of Quaaludes begins in 1951, at a research institute in India, where two scientists, Indra Kishore Kakkar and Syed Hussain Zahir, synthesized a new compound while searching for potential anti-malarial treatments. The drug didn't kill malaria, but it did something immediately interesting. It made whatever you were testing it on deeply, profoundly calm. The sedative hypnotic properties were noted and filed away. The compound was called Methaqualone. By 1965, Methaqualone had crossed the Atlantic and entered the American pharmaceutical market. The timing was important. American medicine was in the middle of a reckoning with barbiturates, the class of sleeping pills that had been the standard sedative treatment for decades, and that had accumulated a grim record of overdose deaths and addiction. The medical establishment was actively searching for something safer. Methaqualone looked like the answer. It worked on the brain's GABA-A receptors, producing sedation and muscle relaxation with what drug company marketing materials called a favorable safety profile. William H. Rohrer, Incorporated, branded it Quaalude, a portmanteau of quiet interlude, the AA deliberately echoing Maalox, one of the company's existing bestsellers. The name was designed to sound like peace. Doctors prescribed it liberally for insomnia, anxiety, muscle tension, general stress. Semi-legal stress clinics sprang up in major cities, dispensing maximum legal doses to people who had barely seen a physician. By 1972, Quaaludes were one of the most frequently prescribed sedatives in the entire United States, with more than 34 million prescriptions written in that year alone. The tablet stamped RORER 714 became so iconic the number appeared on t-shirts and in song lyrics. A second manufacturer, Lemon Pharmaceutical Company, produced its own version, and their tablets, Lemon 7s, were equally recognizable to anyone in the circles where these things circulated. What made Quaaludes different from the barbiturates they were supposed to replace was the quality of the high. Barbiturates knocked you out. Methaqualone gave you something more socially engineered, a warm, disinhibiting euphoria that felt closer to a good drunk than to sedation. Users described loosened inhibitions, heightened sensation, a feeling of sociability that made disco-era nightclubs and college dormitories the natural habitat for the drug. Luding out, taking a Quaalude with wine, became a recognized pastime on American campuses, a phrase casual enough to appear in conversation without embarrassment. The white tablet and the glass of wine. A combination that was, as it turned out, considerably more dangerous than either felt in the moment. The drug was everywhere. It had a medical pedigree, a brand name, a familiar pill shape, a trusted number stamped in the center. It was, in the estimation of millions of people who took it, basically fine. What nobody fully understood yet was the precise mechanism by which it wasn't fine at all, and how the architecture of that misunderstanding would eventually determine whether the drug could be eliminated or whether it would simply survive, the way nearly every other banned substance has survived. At the height of the Quaalude era, roughly 1970 through the early 1980s, the drug existed simultaneously in two worlds. In the medical world, it was a legitimate pharmaceutical, prescribed in 300 milligram tablets for insomnia and anxiety, available at any pharmacy with a slip of paper from any cooperative physician. In the nightlife world, it was the disco biscuit. The thing passed around in Studio 54 and 1,000 clubs like it, taken with alcohol, taken in doses well above what any physician would sanction, producing a state that users found irresistible and that carried risks they mostly did not calculate in real time. The gap between those two worlds was bridged by the stress clinics, semi-legal operations where, as the writer Justin Gass documented, doctors were essentially giving them out like candy. You didn't need to have trouble sleeping. You didn't need anxiety. You needed to show up, and the maximum legal prescription was yours. What made Quaaludes so widely available was structural, not accidental. Methaqualone was a legitimate pharmaceutical product, manufactured to pharmaceutical standards, distributed through licensed channels. The supply chain was legal, regulated, and enormous. The black market, in the early years, was largely downstream of the legal market. Pills diverted from prescriptions, from the stress clinics, from the same distribution network that served every pharmacy in America. There was no clandestine chemistry required, no jungle laboratory, no cross-border smuggling of a controlled substance. You got them from a doctor, or from someone who got them from a doctor. The critical pharmacological detail that the early marketing obscured was this: Methaqualone and alcohol, taken together, are not merely additive in their danger, they are synergistic. Co-administration of alcohol reduced the lethal dose of methaqualone by 19 to 40%, depending on the amount of alcohol involved. The people mixing ludes with wine at college parties were, without knowing it, dramatically reducing the margin between the dose that produced euphoria and the dose that stopped their breathing. Between 1971 and 1981, 68 Americans died from Quaalude overdoses. The combination with alcohol, combined with the impaired judgment the drug induced, produced an additional estimated 178 deaths through accidents, car crashes, falls, during that same period. The drug was, in the era's casual calculus, considered mostly safe. It had a pharmaceutical pedigree, it had a brand name, it had a number you could look up. By 1973, the government had already moved methaqualone to Schedule II, meaning a prescription was required and refills were restricted. The black market, by that point, had already adapted. Pills were flooding in from Colombia, manufactured not in pharmaceutical labs, but in clandestine operations that had no interest in purity standards or dosage consistency. The legal crackdown had created the illegal market. What the DEA would have to figure out, and what it had never done successfully with any other drug, was how to shut down a supply chain that was no longer on American soil. By the early 1980s, the illicit methaqualone market had fundamentally restructured. Legal domestic production had been severely curtailed. The pills flooding American streets were counterfeit, manufactured primarily in Colombia by drug trafficking organizations that had recognized methaqualone as a profitable sideline to their cocaine business. The DEA estimated illicit production at 150 metric tons annually in the early 1980s, over 20 times the amount of legitimate methaqualone produced legally worldwide. Operation Swordfish, a DEA investigation targeting Miami's organized drug trade, seized 250,000 methaqualone pills in a single operation, alongside large quantities of marijuana and cocaine. The scale was staggering. Raids and seizures alone were not going to solve it. The DEA official who changed the equation was named Gene Hayslip, head of the agency's Chemical Control Division. His insight was straightforward, but had never been operationalized at scale. Methaqualone was a synthetic compound sophisticated enough that the Colombian cartels manufacturing it couldn't synthesize the precursor chemicals themselves. They had to source them from somewhere else. Hayslip followed the chemical supply chain from Miami to Barranquilla to Hungary to Austria to Germany. At each node, he worked with local governments to cut off the legal export of methaqualone precursors to illegal buyers. He did not need to arrest the drug lords. He needed to close the chemical tap. Gradually, the sources dried up. The Colombian operations could not manufacture without the key precursor chemicals, and the key precursor chemicals were becoming unavailable. By the late 1980s, Hayslip told PBS Frontline simply, "We beat 'em." The illegal Methaqualone supply from Colombia had effectively collapsed. The strategy worked on Quaaludes specifically, and why it has never worked as cleanly on any other drug since, was the chemical complexity of the compound. Methaqualone requires specific industrial precursors that cannot easily be replaced or improvised. Unlike cocaine, which can be derived from a cultivated plant, or methamphetamine, which can be synthesized from a range of available starting materials, Methaqualone's manufacturing chain is narrow and traceable. Once the key precursor supply was controlled internationally, clandestine production became practically difficult rather than merely illegal. The drug's own chemistry was its undoing. Lemon Pharmaceutical ceased production in 1983. The DEA moved Methaqualone to Schedule I in 1984, setting the annual manufacturing quota for research purposes at 60 grams, the equivalent of 200 standard tablets per year, enough for laboratory study and essentially nothing else. The drug that had generated 34 million prescriptions in a single year was reduced to a rounding error. By the end of the decade, Quaaludes had disappeared from American streets almost completely. For once, the war on drugs had actually won one. Quaaludes didn't vanish because they became unpopular. They didn't vanish because society had a moral awakening. They vanished for a reason that has almost nothing to do with culture or willpower or the persuasive power of Nancy Reagan's public service announcements. They vanished because a single government official had the insight to trace a supply chain to its chemical headwaters and methodically cut off the flow. And because the specific chemistry of methaqualone made that possible in a way it isn't for most substances. The lesson of the Quaalude is not that the war on drugs can be won through political will. It's that it can, under very specific technical conditions, be won through supply chain interruption at the precursor level. Those conditions have almost never existed again. Quaaludes still exist in one place. In South Africa, the drug never left. Sold as mandrax, methaqualone remains the second most commonly used illicit substance in the country. The preferred method is a white pipe, the tablet crushed, mixed with cannabis, and smoked through the broken neck of a glass bottle. The Western Cape Province records methaqualone prevalence rates of 29% among those in drug treatment programs. In September 2020, South African law enforcement raided a trafficking network and found an estimated 3.9 tons of methaqualone powder in a single house. The disco biscuit that Americans treated as a relic of a more reckless era is, in South Africa, a present-tense public health crisis. If you lived through the era, or if this is all new information, tell us in the comments. What did you know about Quaaludes growing up? And did you know the story of how they actually disappeared? Or did you always assume it was just another casualty of the Reagan years? If you found this useful, please leave a like. It helps more people find the channel. Subscribe for more videos like this one.